Lovely. Okay, well, welcome along, everybody. This event is hosted by the English Association, which is the subject association for English. We span the whole discipline from primary and early years through secondary and further education up to higher education. And this event is part of our event series, which runs throughout the year. So make sure you pop back to our website and just keep looking what we've got going on because there's always something that will catch your attention. So, as I said earlier, I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Exec of the EA. I'm really pleased to see you all this evening. Now I'm going to stop banging on and hand over to our speakers who are going to tell us all about periodical pedagogies. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you for the introduction and for inviting us to do this session for the English Association. I'm Victoria Bazin, and I'm joined by Amy Fudge and Eleanor Careless. And between the three of us, we're going to be talking about what we're describing as periodical pedagogies. That is connected to a larger project that we're doing, which is called Liberating Histories. And as you can see from this first slide, you can follow Liberating Histories on Instagram and Twitter. So please do that, if you want to find out more about the project and get involved as well. So if we can have the second slide, Eleanor, that'd be great. Thank you. This project's funded by the AHRC. It's based at Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne, and we are partnered with the wonderful Women's Library. And the full title of the project, I think, really helps to give you a sense of all the different things that we're doing. So the full title is Liberating Histories, Women's Movement Magazines, Media Activism, and Periodical Pedagogies. So we're looking at those three aspects. First of all, we're looking at women's movement magazines. So you've probably heard of magazines such as Spare Rib, but also lesser known publications such as Shocking Pink, Red Rag, Outright, Women's Report, Mukti, Scarlet Women, a whole range of magazines. And we're going from roughly 1968 to the present moment. And we're thinking about the makers of these magazines, and we're also thinking about the influence that these magazines had on readers' lives. So one of the things we're doing that's really important is we are creating an archive of readers' testimonies, which is basically going to kind of store those testimonies, and it's going to explore the influence that the magazines had on readers. So if you know anyone who you think might be able to give us a testimony, please let them know about this project. So that's the first part of the project, Women's Movement Magazines. The second part of the project is called Media Activism, and we're thinking about the connections between digital and print activism. So we're linking #feminism to the feminist activism of the 1970s, 80s, and early 1990s. And that's the sort of second section, the second part of the project. So we're thinking about the difference that media makes, essentially, media technologies make in terms of shaping women's activism. And the third part of the project is why we're here today. We are thinking about periodical pedagogy. So we're thinking about using women's movement magazines as resources in the classroom. And so one of the things we've been doing is we have been developing these resources with Amy, who's a former teacher and who's been advising and guiding us on this. And more specifically, we've been thinking about how we might develop resources for the study of A-level English literature texts. So maybe if we could move to the next slide, Eleanor. We'll get there. Something's happened to our slides, but we'll get there. Well, I'll carry on while we're finding the slides. There we go. We are developing these resources on The Handmaid's Tale, and you can see this is just a screenshot from the website. So if you go to the website, you'll see these resources there. You'll see these different tiles, and you see that we've got 3 different themes: bodies, politics, media. And if you tapped on those tiles, then that would bring you to the PowerPoint slides for a way of kind of basically using magazines to think about certain aspects of the novel. So what we're going to do today is we are going to initially think a little bit more about our project. If maybe you could go to the next slide, Eleanor. And I'm going to give you some information about the kinds of resources that are available that aren't necessarily directly attached to studying A-level English literature. And these are the sorts of resources that perhaps might be useful for teachers and for students who are interested in finding out more about the women's liberation movement. So for instance, what we have is a feminist guide, a guide to feminist periodicals. And again, we've used these tiles, and when you tap on the tile, you'll find more information about these individual titles. So here's Spare Rib, for instance. You can see you've got the dates of Spare Rib. You've got the fact that it was a monthly magazine, the price when it was first issued, place of publication, and circulation. We don't always have all this information, but we're gathering as much of it as possible. So those are more resources on the website that you might want to have a look at, and that you might want to use in developing your own materials to support not just the Handmaid's Tale, but perhaps other lessons in the classroom that think about issues related to feminism and gender. So everything that I'm showing you on these slides is on our website. It's all freely available. It's at liberatinghistories.org. So feel free to visit those slides and to download them. This is the plan for the session. So I've already done some introduction, and I've talked a little bit about the project itself and its resources. But then we're going to talk a little bit more about specifically English literature at A-level. And Amy's going to talk about context, and she's going to kind of walk us through some of the challenges, should we say, of encouraging students to contextualize literary material. But basically, what we want to do is we want to use magazines to help students contextualize English literature. We think that that might be a useful way of doing that. And we're focusing on women's movement magazines, but I think that actually periodicals more generally can enhance our understanding of literature. For instance, I mean, I just took a quick look at some of the syllabus. We've got The Great Gatsby on there, F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel from the 1920s. And you can see the ways in which a study of magazines would very much enhance that text. Magazines are mentioned, periodicals are mentioned throughout that novel. So that might be quite a fun way of thinking about that novel. A familiarity with magazines, American magazines from the late 19th century, could inform your interpretation of Kate Chopin's The Awakening. So there are other texts perhaps that you could look at in the light of contemporary periodicals. But what we're arguing today is that a familiarity with the debates that were taking place in women's movement magazines can help us engage with the complexities of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. And I think that's the point, that's the key point I want to make. It's a complex novel. And the more times I read this novel, the more complex it gets, actually. So exploring these debates, the questions, the concerns, the anxieties within the magazines, I don't think necessarily gives us an answer to what the novel's all about, not one singular answer. And it doesn't necessarily tell us everything that we need to know about the novel. But I think it does give us a sense of how the novel contains these complexities. It weaves them into the narrative through particular motifs, imagery, and the themes that it explores. So I think thinking about context in terms of its etymology, the term context originally meant weaving together, helps us to think about how we might relate or connect or weave together women's movement magazines with Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel. It helps students to understand the novel as something that weaves together the complexities of its culture. So now I'm going to hand over to Amy, who is going to talk a little bit more about context in relation to the A-level syllabus.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, thinking about context in relation to the A-level syllabus. So as Victoria just discussed, when we were thinking about context, we looked at where the word context came from, and there it is on our screens. So it's a connecting, a weaving together. And as I'm going to discuss in a moment, so often what we see with our students is them just kind of popping a little bit of context into the middle of the argument, a bit like that picture on the top, rather than weaving it through their argument and using it to weave together the text, their ideas, and the world that these things actually exist in. At the next, lovely. So here's something all of the teachers in the room will be really familiar with anyway, and that's the A-level English literature specification in relation to 803, which is context. I'm not going to spend too much time looking at this, but I did want to spend a little bit of time thinking about context a little bit more broadly, and maybe thinking a little bit about AQA Spec B approach as well, as I think it might be a little bit more difficult to think about how these periodicals and magazines could be used for those students when we're not thinking about, historical information. So thinking about context a little bit more broadly and thinking about Spec B, with this understanding of context, rather than asking students to discuss historical facts and information, we're asking them to bring their own context by addressing the issues raised in the text. But how do our students reflect on the world around them and engage with discussions such as discussions about power, corruption, conspiracy, gender politics, and the power of the media? Where do these ideas for our students come from, and where do these conversations happen? And as teachers, I think we need to facilitate those conversations in the classroom, and these periodicals are a great way to begin having those debates in the classroom, as you'll hopefully see a little bit later on. Now, every year, the various examiner reports discuss context, and we have a very similar thing. If you want to just have a little look at the bottom of the slide there, I'll give you a minute to read that. So examiners discuss how students could improve their answers by context being integrated and linked to their ideas and the points that they're making about the text, that weaving through approach that we discussed rather than bolting on. And I just wanted to show you a little example of some of this. So this is something, again, all the teachers in the room will be familiar with. This is a GCSE student answering a question on the supernatural in Macbeth. So again, I'll just give you a moment to have a little read of that. So just to be really clear, I'm not bashing this response. This student was a really hardworking and brilliant student. The rest of the response was absolutely excellent. And they did get an 8 this summer. But you can see how they're just really desperately trying to insert some context. And rather than it adding to their argument, instead, it's done completely the opposite. And it's taking them away from their argument, and it's taking them away from the text. So I think these are the kind of questions we need to be trying to get our students to think about when using context, or it does end up just being this kind of bolted on information. So how does this information offer us an insight into the text? If it doesn't belong there. How does the text make comment on the contextual issues you're discussing in relation to the question? The next. So context needs to be something that's helping students to weave together their ideas, the issues, and the text, almost like a two-way conversation between the text and the context. And having a voice in that conversation between the text and the context is what we're trying to help students do with these periodicals. By facilitating a conversation about contextual issues, both historical and current, we can aid students in a reflection on the issues raised in the periodicals and help them develop a stance. I think it's much easier for them to think about how these contextual issues open up and relate to their interpretation of the text, and about how the text is engaging with and commenting on these issues once they understand them and actually can argue about these issues a little bit better.
So we're going to be thinking about how do these contextual issues open up the interpretation of the text, and how does the text make a commentary on the contextual issues. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleagues now, and we're going to have a little look at The Handmaid's Tale and hopefully see some of this in action. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Sorry for the glitch on the slide earlier. I forgot I'd embedded a link, and so whenever I clicked it, instead of going to the next slide, it took me to our website. Actually, I didn't immediately realize. Anyway, so here is one of the workshops, one of the PowerPoints you can find on our website that Victoria was talking about earlier. And this is the resource on feminist magazines, media, and The Handmaid's Tale. We also have resources on the themes of bodies and politics. So I'm just going to give you a quick and slightly condensed spin through what this would look like in lesson form. So we've already taught some of this material in schools to A-level students studying The Handmaid's Tale. And yes, these are the key questions that we will be discussing in this particular lesson or workshop or PowerPoint. What is a feminist magazine? What issues were feminists interested in, and how do feminist magazines feature in The Handmaid's Tale? And here are some of those feminist magazines. The first is Red Rag, a British socialist feminist magazine. We've got Spare Rib, we've got Outright, which is actually a newspaper. Branching Out is a Canadian feminist arts magazine that Margaret Atwood might be more familiar with, and Ms. magazine, which you're perhaps most likely to have heard of. Ms. does make a brief appearance in The Handmaid's Tale towards the end, when it's one of the texts that Offred mentions the commander gives her to read in his study. And she recognizes it because it's a magazine that was often lying around her mother's house when she was growing up. So first of all, we look at two front covers of two very different magazines, both published in 1978. The front cover of Spare Rib magazine, a feminist, the longest running, in fact, British feminist magazine, and Cosmopolitan, which again, you will probably have heard of. Both of these magazines were established in 1972, so they've been running for the same number of years. And if we look at these two front covers, I'll give you a few moments to have a look at these images. Yeah, we want to think about the key differences that you can see, and we're thinking about content, because of course the covers advertise the content contained within the magazines, thinking about the use of images, maybe layout, the use of language, and possibly branding, or the sort of overall look of each cover. So I'll just give you a couple of moments to look at those covers. So the Cosmopolitan cover, as you can see, features a woman looking directly at the camera, wearing a revealing blouse and lots of makeup, and perfectly groomed hair. And the sorts of articles that we can see in this issue of Cosmo revolve around sex and relationships, celebrity gossip, diet culture, women's health advice, and romantic stories. There are a few examples of the promises that these magazines offered to their readers. For instance, you can see an article on the diet for the girl who doesn't have time to diet. And we also have what celebrities do to make themselves feel better when they are low. And we're going to come back to this idea of these sorts of promises that magazines offer their readers later. The sorts of promises that sound a bit too good to be true. Spare Rib, on the other hand, has a darkly humorous cover image showing an image of two cleaning women being crushed by the weights of the dirty plates they have to wash. We can see there are articles on men and childcare. The comically titled Housewife Needles Patriarchy, an article on the pill, and also some pieces on international issues, women's health centres in Australia and in Zambia. So very different in tone and content and look. There is no objectification on Spare Rib's front cover. And so the reason that we're getting students to warm up by thinking about covers like this is because what we're driving towards at the end of this PowerPoint is an exam question around the power of the media and The Handmaid's Tale. So this gives us an opportunity to think about different sorts of media and the different sort of work they're doing. So how do magazines come into The Handmaid's Tale? There are different types of magazines in the novel, both feminist magazines and also very much not feminist magazines. So let's have a look at the first time that magazines make an appearance in the novel. So this is an extract taken from chapter 7, when Offred, left alone for the night, lets herself daydream about happier times. First, she thinks about her friend Moira, writing a university paper about date rape, whilst also dropping cigarette ash all over her bedclothes. And then she thinks about a time when, as a little girl, her mother took her to the park to feed ducks, only to find some of her mother's feminist friends already in the park, burning magazines. And one of them offers a magazine to Offred to throw into the flames. And this is the start of this extract. The woman handed me one of the magazines. It had a pretty woman on it with no clothes on, hanging from the ceiling by a chain wound around her hands. I looked at it with interest. It didn't frighten me. I thought she was swinging like Tarzan from the vine on the TV. Don't let her see it, said my mother. Here, she said, toss it in, quick. I threw the magazine into the flames. It riffled open in the wind of its burning. Big flakes of paper came loose, sailed into the air, still on fire, parts of women's bodies turning to black ash in the air before my eyes. So we can see that the kind of magazines that Atwood is referring to in this extract are lads' mags or pornographic magazines, magazines that objectify women's bodies. And the women who are burning the magazines are doing so in an act of feminist resistance. So this is a moment of feminist protest that Offred is remembering, but magazines form the centerpiece of this protest. And here are a couple of comprehension questions to go with that extract. And there's another passage which I'm going to hand over to Victoria to tell you about later on in the novel. And this is, this extract is taken from Offred's second visit to the commander's study. If you remember, they start playing Scrabble together, and he also starts giving her reading material. And this is a much, magazines feature much more largely in this episode, but I'm going to let Victoria talk to you about this.
Thank you, Eleanor. You can imagine how thrilled we were when we suddenly found all these references to magazines throughout The Handmaid's Tale, and every extract is kind of really interesting, but this one in particular we thought was particularly worth dwelling on. This time it's about mainstream women's magazines. We thought that this told us something about the power relations between Offred and the commander, but also something about Offred's previous life. So what I'm going to do is read it out first of all, and then we'll think about the questions. It's quite a long passage, but I just think it would be nice to really sort of get immersed in this extract just for a few minutes. He smiled a little. Then he pulled open the top drawer of his desk and took something out. He held it a moment, casually enough between thumb and finger, as if deciding whether or not to give it to me. Although it was upside down from where I was sitting, I recognized it. They were once common enough. It was a magazine, a women's magazine, it looked like from the picture, a model on glossy paper, hair blown, neck scarfed, mouth lipsticked, the fall fashions. I thought such magazines had all been destroyed, but here was one left over in a commander's private study where you'd least expect to find such a thing. He looked down at the model, who was right side up to him. He was still smiling, that wistful smile of his. It was a look you'd give to an almost extinct animal at the zoo. Staring at the magazine as he dangled it before me like fish bait, I wanted it. I wanted it with a force that made the ends of my fingers ache. At the same time, I saw this longing of mine as trivial and absurd, because I'd taken such magazines lightly enough once. I'd read them in dentist's office and sometimes on planes. I'd bought them to take to hotel rooms, a device to fill in empty time while I was waiting for Luke. After I'd leafed through them, I would throw them away, for they were infinitely discardable. And a day or two later, I wouldn't be able to remember what had been in them. Though I remembered now, what was in them was promise. They dealt in transformations. They suggested an endless series of possibilities, extending like the reflections in two mirrors set facing one another, stretching on, replica after replica, to the vanishing point. They suggested one adventure after another, one wardrobe after another, one improvement after another, one man after another. They suggested rejuvenation, pain overcome and transcended, endless love. The real promise in them was immortality. This was what he was holding without knowing it. He riffled the pages. I felt myself leaning forward. It's an old one, he said, a curio of sorts, from the 70s, I think, a Vogue. So we have some questions around this extract, and I imagine it would take quite some time to work through these questions with the classroom, because this is, as I said before, a very kind of dense extract, and there's an awful lot going on here. But these are the questions, and what I'm going to do is just ask these three questions, but then give you a little time to mull over, to think about these questions, and to maybe think about the kinds of responses that you would encourage the students developing in the classroom. And feel free, if you are willing to and able to respond in the chat with some of your ideas. And remember, there are no wrong or incorrect responses. We're just sort of keen to find out what you think about this particular passage and how you might respond to these questions. So the first question is, why does the commander give Offred this magazine? So thinking about the reasons for kind of offering this magazine to Offred. I think the language around that's really, really interesting, how Atwood describes this almost as an erotic encounter between the commander and Offred, but I think there's more to say there. Why does Offred want the magazine? Why is she leaning towards it? And what does the magazine represent to Offred? So those are our three questions. I'll just give you a few minutes to just think about those, and maybe put something in the chat if you've got some inspiring ideas.
I have put the questions into the chat already, so if we wanted to go back to the actual passage so we can have them both on the screen. There we are.
Okay. This is one of those occasions where I know I am always really slow to put things in the chat because it just takes me ages to use the chat facility, but hopefully some of you have some ideas. And of course, one of the things that we are thinking about in this series of slides, and I suppose it's a kind of lesson plan that we're offering here, but it's a lesson plan that teachers, we assume, will basically adapt and kind of mess around with, because, you know, they'll think of their own sort of perspectives and their own points that they wish to make, and so they can certainly use this material and change it in ways that they think is helpful. So we're developing this lesson plan, but we're trying to think about the ways in which we are leading those students towards that overarching question about the influence of the media in the novel. So we're trying to do that incrementally. We're trying to initially think about playing to students' strengths. So looking at those front covers of magazines and allowing students to make observations about what they can see. And I don't know about you, but certainly my students, my undergraduate students, are really, really good at analysing visual imagery, you know, visual text. That seems to be kind of their media where they're most kind of comfortable. And so that often works very well as a way of warming students up. So we've got that initial exercise, and then we've got the close reading of the first passage, which is about burning pornographic magazines. And then we've got this last extract where we've got a very detailed and sort of involved extract about Vogue magazine. And I think one of the things that happens in these two extracts, and I think one of the ways in which they're linked together, is through that word riffled. I noticed it appears in both those extracts, and I just thought that was really interesting. That was sort of something that connected these magazines to each other, which you wouldn't necessarily do automatically. So in other words, what is the connection between the pornographic magazine and Vogue magazine? You know, so that's something that students might pick up on. So we'll kind of return to your responses at the end if you have any, and if you want to pick up on any questions. But I'll go through these questions now, just very, very quickly, to think about the kinds of responses that we might develop in terms of analysing this passage and its significance in the novel. So that first question, why does the commander give Offred this magazine? I mean, even though he has ultimate power, he's the commander, he has control over Offred, it seems as if in this passage he wants something more. He wants her complicity, he wants her agreement. You might say that before Gilead, magazines like Vogue perhaps operated in a similar way. Eleanor talked about that promise, the ways in which the mainstream magazines kind of lure or seduce perhaps even the magazine reader into believing that she can transform her life if she buys the latest fashions or the newest makeup, if she changes her man. That these transformations are possible, and you'll be guided through these transformations through the magazine, the mainstream magazine. So perhaps Vogue operates in a similar way to persuade women to enjoy their complicity, the complicity of their own oppression, essentially, to actually choose it. There's a sense in which the commander is requiring or asking Offred to be complicit in her own oppression. So the second question is related to why she wants the magazine. Why is she leaning towards the magazine? What is it about the magazine that she desires? Now, I think that sense of desire, as I said, I talked before about that erotic charge, is particularly important here and is generated through the language that Atwood uses. And I think I'm going to just hand over to you, Eleanor, momentarily, because you had a wonderful student response to this question, didn't you? Where they were picking up on how the commander was using the magazine in his relationship, in his in his relationship with Offred.
Yeah, when I was teaching this at a school a few months ago, and we were thinking about this question, one of the students suggested that this is almost a grooming scene, because if you remember a few chapters later, the commander takes Offred to Jezebel's, this kind of underground nightclub, and he dresses her up for the occasion, and then she has to hide in the footwell of his car. And this scene here seems like a sort of rather sinister preparation for this later scene, and I thought that was really observant, very insightful.
Yeah, it's a great example, isn't it, of students really picking up on something in the text and kind of recognizing the ways in which, you know, the text is sort of explaining something that's going on that's not been kind of openly or explicitly articulated. So I thought that was really insightful. So the next question is, why does Offred want the magazine? And I suppose, you know, the initial response to that question would be something like, well, it reminds her of a time when she had a different life, a better life. She had some freedom, some autonomy. And then she goes into this memory about when she would be reading the magazine, you know, on what kind of occasion would she pick up a Vogue, for instance. And she talks about waiting in a dentist's office, for instance. And she talks about also waiting for Luke in a hotel room. And so we get another kind of insight into Offred's life before Gilead. She's waiting for her lover in the hotel room. She's waiting for him. They have to meet in a hotel because he's married at this point. And there's quite a long kind of period of time when she is, in inverted commas, the other woman. he's married to somebody else, and it takes him some time to extricate himself from that relationship, and then for the two of them to move in together. But it's this idea that Offred's waiting. She is waiting for Luke. She's waiting for a man. She has this supposed free time, and in that free time, she needs to fill that time. And the ways in which she fills that time, the ways in which she takes her mind off, perhaps, the business of waiting for him, is to immerse herself in the promise of the magazine, the mainstream magazine, the promise of that other life. So we've got intimations there of the kind of freedom Offred had, and the ways in which that freedom is circumscribed. You know, it's not total and complete freedom or liberation. So we get that insight into Offred's other life, her former life, through Vogue magazine. And then the last question is, what does the magazine represent to Offred? And, you know, we have already talked about that other life, the life before Gilead. But one of the things that we've started to talk about are the parallels between her previous life and her life in Gilead. And these parallels are the things that I think the magazines help us to explore, the parallels and the connections and the intersections between the old life and the new life, between the supposedly free life and then the life of imprisonment and oppression that she experiences in Gilead. So I think that's the kind of shift that one would try to make in terms of encouraging the students, not necessarily to see that there is just a simple opposition between the former life and the present life, but that there are connections between those two lives. So I just wanted to really kind of now pull together the various aspects of this lesson plan in order to move us towards that overarching question about the media. Eleanor and Amy, if you think of anything important that you want to interject, please feel free to interrupt me. So we've got these close reading exercises, but we kicked off the session with the comparison between the front covers of Spare Rib and Cosmopolitan. Then we moved on to the scene with the pornographic magazines being burnt by feminist activists. And then we were looking at the scene where the commander is offering Offred a copy of Vogue. We've talked about the connections between these scenes, and we've talked about the parallels between Gilead and Offred's former life. And we've talked about perhaps these two scenes and how the magazines illustrate the subtle and perhaps not so subtle ways in which women were subordinated, exploited, objectified in Offred's former life. So we've got the pornography and Vogue, and as I say, we're encouraged to think about those things as being in some ways related or connected. I think introducing Spare Rib into this discussion, even just that front cover, I think is really, really useful for students. It shows them that there were debates taking place about gender at the time that Atwood was writing this novel. Debates taking place about gender equality at work, about childcare, and about reproductive rights. And also that Spare Rib was at least trying to move beyond a white Western feminist perspective in the articles on, for instance, women farmers in Zambia. And I mean, we can go back to this in a minute, but I know that Amy talked about context in terms of students' contemporary context, the debates that are taking place now. But those things that I just listed, gender equality at work, childcare, reproductive rights, are still very much live issues, aren't they? They're still very much kind of debates that are taking place at the very, very current as we speak. So you can see straight away that you would be able to connect to those historical debates, but that those historical debates actually haven't gone away, that they're still very much in circulation and still very pressing and important. So then we might start to think about the ways in which the novel contains these debates. So I suppose one of the things that I'm suggesting is that Atwood's very careful not to basically advocate for a certain political position. She doesn't show her hand. She does show how, for instance, feminists challenge pornography and the objectification of women in that first extract. But she also talks about and incorporates into the novel debates within feminism about what liberation means, what it actually means. Does liberation mean being freed from the objectifying male gaze? And if so, what would that look like? You know, could that look like the ways in which the handmaids dress, for instance? Does liberation mean burning offensive books and magazines or banning them? Does liberation mean being free to choose? And if so, what kinds of choices do women have? And do all women have the same choices? So in other words, I think the kind of the complexities of The Handmaid's Tale is not just, it's not enough to say it's just a feminist novel, if you see what I mean, because within feminism, within feminist debates are a range of complex arguments and debates that are still ongoing. And that's what we want students to connect to, the sense of those debates as they're in circulation within the novel itself. And I suppose I just want to touch on very, very briefly, just one more thing that might open up a whole nother set of questions about the novel. But I think it really gets at the heart of what The Handmaid's Tale is all about. And it's questions that circulate around reproductive rights. That question about who has the right to choose and who doesn't. And this might develop into a wider discussion of the ideology that underpins the formation of Gilead, this new society, this brave new world. And if we look at the end of the novel and we look at Professor Piexoto's analysis, his historical overview of Gilead, we can see that he points to a racial ideology that's in circulation that underpins the formation of Gilead as a society. He says that this was an age, quote, of plummeting Caucasian birth rates, a phenomenon observable, but not only in Gilead, but in most northern Caucasian societies of the time. And a little later, he refers to the, quote, differing statistics among Caucasians and non-Caucasians. So in other words, Gilead is a state created out of racial paranoia, and controlling reproduction becomes a way to protect white supremacy. So in other words, woven into the fabric of the novel is a discussion of women's rights that draws on debates within feminism, but those debates complicate our understanding of those rights. I think they complicate our understanding of those rights in intersectional terms. So we're not just talking about the rights of women as if all women were the same, but we're talking about the rights or rights in terms of who has and who has not the right to choose and why, basically. And I think this is kind of one of the really interesting aspects of the novel. And you almost think it's in the margins of the novel, but actually, as I said before, it underpins, I think, the formation of Gilead itself as a society. And it's a really interesting way of thinking about the novel. So I'm going to stop talking there because I think I've gone on for quite some time. And it's 5:30, so I want to make sure that we do have some time for questions. We're going to also tell you a little bit about future projects as well, so we want to make sure we have time for that. But so far, any questions about anything that we've talked about or we've discussed, or perhaps any potential issues or problems that you think you might encounter if you try to unroll this kind of lesson in your own classroom? Because I'm sure it won't be all plain sailing for most teachers. No, any thoughts? Or as I say, any potential pitfalls or problems that you can see if you were going to try and use some of this material in your own classroom? Well, I tell you what, why don't we give you a bit more time to think about that? And while you're thinking about it, maybe we can plug some new resources that we're in the process of developing, again, connected to the project, but actually taking the project in a different direction, and I think a really exciting direction. So should I hand back to you, Amy? Is that okay?
Hi, yeah. So one of the new things that we are working on is one of the new texts that AQA have brought on the syllabus, The Princess and the Hustler, looking at ways of diversifying the curriculum. So we've started to put together some resources, some workshops. We do have a workshop that's happening at Women's Library. Hopefully this month, maybe that might be pushed back to the end of the year. But if you want to have any information about that, that should all be on our website as well. So yeah, there aren't a lot of resources out there for Princess and the Hustler at the moment. So hopefully once we have those up and running, they should be really useful if you are planning on teaching this exciting new text.
Yeah, so do let us know if you're thinking about teaching that text, because we'd love to work with you. But I think we're particularly excited about developing materials on Princess and the Hustler, because as Amy says, there's just very little out there. There's one book that's going to be published in September, but apart from that, there's nothing. And we recognise that it's very difficult for teachers to generate their own resources all by themselves. So we're going to try and develop similar kinds of resources to the ones that we've developed for The Handmaid's Tale on this GCSE text. And we also think it's particularly important because it's great that these new texts are on the curriculum. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic initiative. But as long as teachers are kind of not, if they don't have the support, if they don't have the resources to help them deliver these texts in the classroom, it's going to be very difficult for them to pick up these texts and to introduce them onto the GCSE curriculum in their schools. So we think it's a great way of encouraging the diversification of the English literature syllabus, and we think that that's very important to do. So if there aren't any more questions, I wonder whether we could maybe just take a quick look at the other resources that we've got on the website. Do you think that's a good idea, Eleanor? Just so that you've got an idea of what else we've been doing.
Do you mean by navigating the website itself, Victoria?
Maybe that. Do you think that would be the best? Yeah, I think that's probably the best way of doing it.
I think we're out of slides.
Yeah.
Sure. Or maybe the easiest way to do this, I don't want to have any technical issues at this point because I know we're slightly over time, is to quickly go back just to maybe a quick reminder. Is that helpful?
That would be great.
Yeah, so these are the PowerPoints, and we went through media today, but we also have politics and bodies, and Victoria mentioned reproductive issues in The Handmaid's Tale, and that very much comes up in Bodies, where we look at an article from Spare Rib about reproduction and the sort of feminist politics of that. In politics, that lesson plan looks more closely at feminism in The Handmaid's Tale and the different sorts of feminism we encounter. And also we read the novel through a contemporary review that was published in Ms magazine of The Handmaid's Tale. So there's much more to look at there. And then, yes, we're adding to our periodicals guide all the time. There are 3 more magazines which are about to be added to this. So that's exciting, and that will keep getting bigger over the next few months.
Thanks, Eleanor. I'm so sorry, everyone, that we have gone over time. I was going to carry on forever and ever, but thank you very, very much for listening, and feedback would be fantastic. If you could tell us what you think about these materials, if you've used them in the classroom, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you ever so much to Amy and Eleanor and Victoria for a fascinating multi-layered discussion, which I'm sure you will all be taking home to your classrooms. I will be in touch with asking you for some brief feedback, and I'll also let you know when the recording is on the website so you can come back and revisit it. I know I will, to sort of get the most out of it. So thank you again to our speakers. They are the reason that we can put on events like this for you to come along to for free. The other really important ingredient in here is our members. Our members enable the EA to work towards its mission, which is to support, defend and promote the discipline of English. So if you would pop along to our website and think about joining us, become one of our members and support our advocacy for the subject, that would be wonderful. But for now, I will leave you to enjoy your evenings. Thank you very much to everyone and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Bye.